Olivia James entered the courthouse with a calm, measured step, her dark eyes scanning the room as if she had seen it all before. She wasn't nervous. In fact, she had been in rooms like this many times, though not always for reasons one might expect. Today, however, it was for something mundane, just a small fine she needed to settle, something that was easily forgotten once it was over. But to her, the courtroom felt like a strange place, filled with an energy that was part uncertainty and part authority. Judge Peter Williams glanced up from his papers as she was called to the front. He was in his late 50s, with the usual gray hair and serious demeanor that came with years on the bench. A man used to presiding over routine cases, a man who believed in the power of law to maintain order, even if it meant sometimes handing down harsh judgments. He had seen his fair share of defendants, people who came in with excuses, who were clearly trying to avoid responsibility. He expected the same from Olivia James. As she walked up to the stand, Judge Williams studied her for a moment. She was well-dressed, a professional air about her that didn't match the typical defendant in his courtroom. Her confident posture suggested someone accustomed to standing in front of crowds, speaking to large audiences. But today, she was just another name on the docket. Nothing special. The case was straightforward. Olivia had received a traffic citation for a minor infraction. She wasn't contesting it, and her explanation was simple: a miscommunication about parking rules. It seemed like an open and shut case. Judge Williams began his usual script, instructing her to pay the fine and informing her of the procedure. But Olivia didn't simply agree and move on. She spoke clearly and respectfully, giving details about her schedule that highlighted how meticulous she was with her time. "I make it a point to follow the rules," she said, "but sometimes even the smallest misunderstanding can cause a ripple effect." It was a simple statement, yet there was something compelling in the way she said it. A quiet confidence, as if she knew that small moments, even ones that seemed insignificant, had the power to create change. Judge Williams raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thank you, Ms. James. The fine is set at $75, he announced, his voice steady. But as Olivia walked back to take her seat, something lingered in the air. The judge could feel it. A subtle shift. His mind began to wander. Who was this woman, really? Why did she seem so different from everyone else? She didn't seem like someone who just accepted things at face value. It wasn't about the fine or the ticket anymore. There was something deeper about her, something he couldn't quite place. As the next case was called, Judge Williams tried to focus, but the question kept gnawing at him. Who was Olivia James? The courtroom returned to its usual rhythm as the next case was called, but for Judge Peter Williams, the lingering thought of Olivia James didn't fade. He tried to push it aside, focusing on the details of the next case, a local business owner disputing a small claim. But every time he looked down at the file or glanced at the attorneys, his mind wandered back to the poised woman who had just left the room. Olivia James, a name that, in that brief moment, had sparked an unfamiliar sense of curiosity. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. It wasn't the fine that stood out. No, that was just another routine procedure. What was it about her presence that made his routine feel different? There was a quiet power in the way she spoke, an authority not from her words, but from something deeper. It was as if she wasn't just participating in the system. She was subtly aware of how the system worked and what it could become. After the day's session wrapped up, Judge Williams sat alone in his office, sorting through paperwork, but his thoughts kept circling back to Olivia. He found himself wondering what her life was like outside of the courtroom. She didn't seem like someone whose world revolved around minor legal matters. She seemed too purposeful for that, too focused. But on what? His curiosity began to itch at him, and he decided to look her up. It didn't take long before the name Olivia James appeared across several online platforms, each one more intriguing than the last. She wasn't just a local figure. She was an advocate for international human rights, a rising voice in the legal reform community. She had been involved in major humanitarian efforts, fighting for the rights of refugees and displaced individuals around the world. Olivia wasn't just participating in discussions, she was driving them. One article mentioned her involvement in a new initiative to reform international human rights laws, specifically pushing for the inclusion of protections for women and minorities in global refugee agreements. Another article featured a picture of her speaking at a United Nations conference, surrounded by legal experts and diplomats. She had been recognized by world leaders for her tireless work, advocating for marginalized groups. And yet here she was, in his courtroom just days ago. No different than any other person in a legal system that often seemed disconnected from the very people it was meant to protect. Judge Williams leaned back in his chair, processing the new information. The woman he had fined so casually was, in fact, a powerful force for change. How had he not seen it? The realization hit him with a mix of awe and disbelief. How could someone so quietly influential be standing in front of him in a small-town courthouse, dealing with something so mundane? The more he learned about her, the more her quiet confidence made sense. Olivia wasn't just working within systems, she was changing them. And now, a strange thought entered his mind. What if this moment, this small interaction, wasn't as trivial as it had seemed? The seed of curiosity was planted. The more Judge Peter Williams uncovered about Olivia James, the more he realized just how far-reaching her impact was. He began to read through several articles and reports detailing her work, each one painting a picture of someone not just advocating for change, but actively creating it. It was hard to reconcile the quiet, composed woman he had found just days ago with the global figure described in the articles. Her name seemed to be everywhere, on news websites, in humanitarian reports, in discussions on legal reform. One article described Olivia's work with displaced populations, focusing on her efforts to ensure that the rights of women and children were prioritized in refugee policies. Another highlighted her role in helping draft new international agreements that addressed the needs of minority groups, specifically Black and Indigenous women, who were often overlooked in traditional humanitarian aid frameworks. There was mention of her leadership in a coalition that worked alongside the United Nations to draft a new set of recommendations for countries to follow in providing refuge and asylum. Judge Williams found himself captivated by one particular interview, where Olivia spoke passionately about the intersectionality of human rights. "The laws that govern us," she had said, "are only as strong as the people they protect. If a law can't protect everyone equally, regardless of race, gender, or status, then it's a law in need of reform." Her words stayed with him as he scrolled through pages of her accomplishments, writing papers, giving speeches at international summits, collaborating with legal experts, and fighting for systemic change. What surprised him most was that Olivia's approach was both intellectual and practical. She wasn't just theorizing about how laws should change. She was offering tangible, actionable solutions. Her strategy involved working directly with governments, legal organizations, and grassroots movements to create policy that was grounded in real-world challenges. As he read on, it became clear that Olivia wasn't simply participating in conversations about human rights. She was reshaping the global narrative around them. Her advocacy was about creating laws that recognized the unique challenges faced by women of color and marginalized communities. She was pushing governments to see that a more inclusive legal system would not only benefit those in need, but also strengthen the very fabric of justice itself. Judge Williams had been blind to it before, but now he saw Olivia's brilliance. She was not just a figure in the background of global change. She was a force that was shaping its very foundation. And yet, despite her accomplishments, she had shown up in his courtroom with the same grace and humility as any other defendant. It made him wonder, how many people like Olivia passed through this courthouse, unrecognized, and how often had the law overlooked those with the potential to reshape it? In the days that followed, Judge Williams found himself thinking about her more often. What had seemed like a simple interaction now felt significant, almost like a missed opportunity to understand the true weight of the woman standing before him. And now, more than ever, he wanted to understand her story. to learn what had brought Olivia James to this point, and how, perhaps, he could play a role in supporting the very changes she was fighting for. Judge Peter Williams couldn't stop thinking about Olivia James. The more he learned about her, the clearer it became that she was no ordinary advocate. She wasn't just working within the confines of existing systems. She was actively challenging them, pushing for a new way of thinking about law, justice, and human rights. Her mission wasn't simply to address issues within the current frameworks. It was to rebuild them from the ground up. Olivia's work on a global scale centered around humanitarian laws that often failed to address the most vulnerable. In one interview, she explained how current refugee policies rarely considered the compounded struggles of women, particularly those from marginalized racial and ethnic groups. She spoke passionately about how gender inequality intersected with race, class, and nationality, creating a layered, often invisible, set of barriers that most international laws fail to address. But what really stood out to Judge Williams was Olivia's focus on solutions. She wasn't just highlighting the flaws in the system, she was fixing them. As part of her work with global coalitions, she had been instrumental in drafting the Global Refugee Protection Framework, a new set of recommendations aimed at ensuring the safety and dignity of refugees, especially women and children. The framework included provisions for gender-sensitive asylum processes and the establishment of international support networks for displaced women and children, all of which challenged the status quo. Reading her speeches and papers, Judge Williams began to see how deeply Olivia understood the complexities of international law. It wasn't just about advocating for change. It was about creating practical solutions that could be adopted by governments, organizations, and courts. She had spent years researching and working with experts across various fields to find ways to reform systems in a manner that was both realistic and effective. What also struck him was how Olivia emphasized the role of the law in shaping societal values. Laws, she had said in one of her interviews, are not just a set of rules. They reflect the morals and priorities of society. If we want to change the world, we must start by changing the laws that govern us. Her belief in the power of law to create a more just world was something Judge Williams couldn't help but resonate with. For him, law had always been about upholding fairness, but Olivia's words added a layer of nuance. Fairness wasn't just about treating everyone the same. It was about recognizing and addressing the unique needs of those who were the most vulnerable. The more he read, the more Judge Williams realized how deeply his own worldview had been shaped by the very systems Olivia was working to transform. The legal system, as he had known it, often ignored the needs of those who were already marginalized, assuming that equality meant simply applying the same rules to everyone. But Olivia's work challenged this. She was advocating for a deeper, more inclusive kind of justice, one that understood and accounted for the different struggles people faced. It was becoming increasingly clear that Olivia wasn't just changing the conversation about law. She was changing the entire approach to it. And as he sat in his office late one evening, Judge Williams made a quiet decision. He would seek her out. It was time to learn from her and understand how he could be a part of the change she was creating. A week after Judge Peter Williams had first delved into Olivia James' work, he received an invitation that caught him by surprise. Olivia was going to be speaking at a local conference on social justice, specifically addressing how legal systems could better serve marginalized communities. It was being held at a nearby law school, and the invitation came from a colleague of his, a lawyer who had heard about his newfound interest in human rights reform. It was the perfect opportunity for the judge to hear Olivia speak firsthand, to see if the powerful ideas he had read about were as compelling in person. He had never attended such a conference before. He had spent most of his career in the courtroom, where discussions centered around the law as it was, not as it could be. But something in him told him that this was exactly where he needed to be. As he walked into the packed lecture hall that afternoon, Judge Williams felt a mix of curiosity and nervous anticipation. Olivia stood at the front of the room, her voice steady but filled with passion. She wasn't just talking about laws. She was painting a picture of a new world, one where laws truly reflected the needs of all people, not just the privileged few. Her words resonated with every corner of the room, but for the judge, they seemed to speak directly to him. "This system," Olivia said, "isn't broken. It's just built on the wrong foundation. The idea of equality in law has always been a myth. Laws that were designed for one group of people simply cannot address the needs of another, especially when that group has been historically oppressed. We must be willing to see that true justice isn't about applying the same rules to everyone. It's about understanding that the most vulnerable need protection, not just equal treatment." The audience was rapt, but for Judge Williams, the words felt like a personal challenge. He had always believed in equality before the law, but Olivia's message pushed him to question what equality truly meant. Was it enough to just apply the same standards to everyone, or was there a deeper layer to justice that had to be addressed? What about the systems that disproportionately affected certain groups of people? What about the inequalities that ran far deeper than the law itself? Olivia continued, addressing how laws could be restructured to provide greater protections for women, refugees, and marginalized communities. She spoke of collaboration between global institutions and grassroots movements, how change was possible when legal experts worked alongside those who had lived the hardships the law often overlooked. By the time she concluded her speech, Judge Williams felt as if his perspective on law had been fundamentally shifted. Her vision wasn't abstract. It was grounded in the real, painful truths of the world. And the more he listened, the more he realized how deeply Olivia's work aligned with his own core values as a judge. She wasn't trying to tear down the law. She was trying to make it whole, to heal it from the inside out. Afterward, the judge approached Olivia, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about a fleeting courtroom interaction anymore. This was a chance to understand the transformative power of the law, and perhaps, just perhaps, to help make a difference. As he introduced himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change the course of both of their lives. After Olivia's powerful speech, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but Judge Peter Williams stood in place, still processing the ideas she had shared. He felt a stirring within him, something he hadn't felt in years, an eagerness to learn, to grow, and to make his work more than just a daily routine. He had spent decades on the bench, convinced of the importance of justice, but now he realized that his understanding of justice was incomplete. He was still lost in thought when he noticed Olivia making her way toward the exit, speaking briefly to a few people along the way. Something urged him forward, a pull he couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, he approached her. "Ms. James," he said, his voice slightly tentative, but filled with genuine admiration. Olivia turned to him with a welcoming smile, recognizing him instantly from the courthouse. For a moment, it felt like they were on equal footing. Two people who had crossed paths in a world of law, but now standing together in a new conversation. "Judge Williams," she said, her tone warm but reserved. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wasn't sure I'd be here either," the judge admitted with a slight chuckle. "But I've been reading about your work, and after hearing you speak today, I felt compelled to introduce myself. Your message, it really resonated with me." Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad. It's easy for people to become disillusioned with the law, to see it as something that's set in stone. But real change happens when we look beyond the surface and understand the deeper, systemic issues that need addressing." Judge Williams hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the shift that had occurred in his own thinking. "I've spent a long time working within the system, trying to apply the law fairly. But I've come to see that fairness isn't enough. It's not always the same as justice." Olivia's eyes softened with understanding. "That's the first step," she said, recognizing that fairness and justice can be two very different things. For some, equality before the law means just applying the same rules to everyone. But we know that isn't always enough, especially when systems themselves are designed in ways that leave certain people vulnerable. "I think I've been blind to that," Judge Williams admitted. "I've always believed in the law's ability to protect people, But I didn't realize how often it fails to protect the most vulnerable, especially those who have been marginalized by the very structures the law is supposed to uphold. Olivia took a deep breath, then smiled slightly. You're not alone in that. Many people, even well-meaning ones, don't see the gaps. But that's how we start, by understanding where the system falls short and then working to fix it. The conversation continued into the evening, both of them speaking more openly about their shared belief in the law's potential for good. But Olivia's words challenged the judge to rethink his own place within it. She spoke of the need for legal professionals to listen to the voices of those who had been silenced, to actively seek out solutions that went beyond the status quo. It was a conversation that would stay with him long after they parted ways. As they said their goodbyes, the judge felt a strange sense of purpose ignite within him. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was someone who had the power to influence the change Olivia was advocating for. The moment he had once seen as trivial, the courtroom encounter with Olivia, had now taken on new meaning. It was no longer just a fine. It was the beginning of a transformative journey. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. In the weeks following that pivotal conversation, Judge Peter Williams found himself thinking more and more about Olivia James' words. Her vision for justice had ignited something in him that he hadn't realized was missing. Every time he entered the courtroom, the weight of her ideas lingered, reshaping his perspective on the cases he presided over. He had spent years striving for fairness, but now he was beginning to see that fairness wasn't always enough. Sometimes true justice required more: understanding, empathy, and action. It wasn't long before the judge began to implement small changes in his courtroom. He started listening more carefully to the stories of those who appeared before him, especially those who seemed to be struggling not just with the law, but with life circumstances that seemed beyond their control. He began to question how he could make his decisions more impactful, not just for the individual cases at hand, but for the community as a whole. One day, Olivia reached out to him. She had been invited to speak at a human rights summit, and she was hoping to gain local support for the initiatives she was spearheading. She wanted Judge Williams to join her, not just as a guest, but as an active participant. The idea was to have legal professionals, judges, attorneys, and lawmakers come together to discuss the intersection of law and human rights, particularly in how the legal system could better serve marginalized communities. At first, the judge hesitated. He had spent decades working within the legal system, and while he had always believed in justice, he had never really thought about how much the system could change. He felt like an outsider in this larger conversation. But as he reflected on the path he had been walking since meeting Olivia, he realized this was his opportunity to do more. This wasn't just about supporting her work. It was about challenging the very system he had spent his career upholding. "I'll be there," he told her. "I'm ready to learn more, and if I can help, I will." The summit was a revelation for the judge. He was surrounded by some of the most passionate, dedicated advocates for human rights he had ever encountered. Legal professionals and activists from around the world shared their insights, pushing him to think beyond the walls of his courtroom. Olivia led several of the discussions, speaking with authority about the need for legal systems to evolve in ways that truly protected the rights of the most vulnerable. During one of the sessions, Judge Williams was asked to speak about the role of the judiciary in creating change. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to articulate his newfound understanding of the law's potential. But as he stood at the podium, something inside him clicked. "I've spent years as a judge, following the law as it was written," he began, his voice steady but full of conviction. "But what I've learned is that laws are not static. They evolve with society, and they must reflect the realities of the people they govern. True justice means seeing beyond the letter of the law and understanding the lived experiences of those who come before us." The words felt true, and for the first time, Judge Williams truly believed them. As the room erupted in applause, he realized that he wasn't just an observer in this movement anymore. He was a participant, and with Olivia by his side, he felt a new sense of purpose. Together, they were not only changing the conversation, they were changing the system itself. As the months passed, Judge Peter Williams became an unexpected champion for the changes Olivia James was working toward. His involvement in the summit marked the beginning of a profound transformation in how he approached his role in the legal system. His influence began to extend beyond his courtroom as he started advocating for reforms at local and national levels. He became a trusted ally, not only in Olivia's efforts but in the growing movement to create a more inclusive and equitable legal system. Judge Williams began to incorporate the lessons he had learned from Olivia into his everyday work. He became a vocal proponent of restorative justice practices and started implementing them in cases where it was appropriate. In his court, he introduced programs aimed at helping people from marginalized communities, particularly women and people of color, get access to education and employment so they could rebuild their lives after a conviction. He even worked with local legal aid organizations to provide pro bono services for those who needed it most. Olivia, meanwhile, was expanding her reach. The framework for international refugee protection that she had worked on was slowly being adopted by various countries, and she began seeing the real-world effects of her advocacy. Governments that had once been resistant to change were now sitting at the table, drafting new policies that prioritized the needs of women and children in refugee camps, as well as those who had been displaced by climate change and conflict. Olivia's name was becoming synonymous with reform on a global scale, but she never lost sight of the local work that had started it all. Small acts of justice that built momentum for larger change. One evening after a particularly long day of meetings, Olivia and Judge Williams found themselves talking at length over coffee, reflecting on how far they had come. Their partnership had become more than just professional. It was rooted in a deep mutual respect for each other's work. It had started with a simple fine in a courtroom, but it had evolved into something much bigger. Together, they had sparked a wave of reform that was being felt across both local and international systems. "You know," Judge Williams said, leaning back in his chair, "I never thought that one small interaction could change everything. But here we are, and it feels like we're just getting started." Olivia smiled, her eyes bright with conviction. "It's amazing, isn't it? How the smallest moments can be the most transformative. We're laying the groundwork for something that will outlive both of us. But it's not just about us. It's about everyone who's been left out of the conversation for too long." The conversation turned to future plans, projects in the works, further collaborations, and the ongoing need to bring more legal professionals into the fold. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still countless barriers to break, systems to challenge, and communities to uplift. But both Olivia and Judge Williams had come to understand that their work was not a single battle. It was a movement, a ripple effect that would continue to grow and spread, pushing the boundaries of justice further than they ever thought possible. As they parted ways that evening, there was a quiet understanding between them. Their journey together had begun with something as simple as a fine, but it had evolved into a partnership that was shifting the very foundations of the legal world. And the ripples they had set in motion would continue to shape the future of justice for generations to come.